Welcome, everyone. This is our final Ask the Expert series of 2025. So thrilled that you're here with us. And I couldn't think of a better topic than Jon's new book, A Guide to Thriving. So really excited to get into that. As we get started, I just want to take a quick minute to acknowledge where I'm standing, which is in Toronto, Canada. And a few years ago, those of you who've been around us for a while know that we made a commitment to reconciliation as part of the Truth and Reconciliation Act, to just become better allies. I think we had some real eye-opening experiences as a team when the discovery of the 215 children in Kamloops, BC happened. And then, of course, since then, it's just escalated that number. And so we're doing what we can. Those of you who know, we hand out a copy of Bob Joseph's book, 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act, as part of our graduation package. And as well, I always like to take a minute just to acknowledge and be grateful for the land that we stand on, that are the traditional territories of many Indigenous and Métis people who've been here for thousands of years before we settlers came along and disrupted everything. So I'm grateful that we have the opportunity. And I think these days, particularly grateful that, I live in Canada and I'm here today with all of you. So thank you so much for being here. And again, take a moment just to acknowledge and appreciate where you are in the world right now. And so if you want to get involved in our project to fund 215 scholarships and bursaries with Inspire, I think we've done about 80 so far. So we're getting there. Feel free to reach out and find out more information about it from Claudia. You can donate on Giving Tuesday to Inspire. They provide scholarships for Indigenous students to continue on, and we support students that are, interested in leadership and business. So that's kind of our focus. All righty. Reminders, we love an interactive crowd. I mean, Jon and I are here to talk, so, but I think of it like we're all here to talk. So throw your questions, throw your own experiences in the chat. This is a chance for us to learn from each other. And in terms of those of you who don't know much about us, we all are about, for us, it's about unleashing collective impact. That expression, it's lonely at the top. I think it's lonely anywhere in leadership, lonely in the middle, on the way to the top was the expression I used to have. And so our focus here is to really look at how do we help organizations really build exceptional culture, exceptional performance through teams, and exceptional leaders. But all of that really starts with the leader. Culture is shaped by leaders. Teams are shaped by leaders. And so we're trying to kind of do that through really the ways that we do it are really primarily through group coaching and team coaching. I'm a big believer in community. We do one-to-one coaching too, often wrapped up in the group and team programs. But the idea is just to really help leaders navigate change, disruption, and growth. That's what we're all about. So if you're interested in any of the programs, do reach out. We're always happy to chat with you about what we do and how we do it. So on that note, let me tell you a little bit about Jon. Jon is the CEO of Anther Global, and I'll get him to tell you, he can give you the 411 on Anther, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how I met Jon. Jon was in one of our programs, Roundtable for Leaders, when he worked at an organization. And so we met through there, and I had a really, I think a really interesting window into where Jon was at. He's going to talk a little bit about where he was at, but an interesting window into where Jon was at that point in his career. And what I love about the work that I get to do is I get to see how leaders evolve. And leadership is an ongoing journey and evolution. I've been, doubling down on this for 30 some odd years now. I still have so much to learn and grow and figure out about myself as a leader. So I'm super grateful for Jon to be here and talk about his new book, A Guide to Thriving, his first book, right? Yeah. And get into it. So Jon, welcome to this podium, and excited to kind of dive into this with you.
Thank you, Klein. I really appreciate the invitation, and it's such a joy to be here with you. And, I'm excited to get into it and talk a little bit more about what landed me here from, what was it, 7 years ago, maybe, that I went through the roundtable?
Yeah, something,
7 or 8 years. Yeah.
Yeah.
So So being here and chatting about kind of the journey and what got me here, it's kind of exciting. And I hope that the folks who are on the call feel comfortable asking questions and jumping in and making this as interactive as we can.
Yeah, 100%. So let's go back in time to that period of time when you and I met. And as you said, you're in our, I call it the signature program, the Roundtable for Leaders, which is really I like to think of it as the inside out program. It starts to get leaders really thinking about who they are and how they're impacting others. But talk to us a little bit about where you were in your corporate career at that point and what you were navigating as a leader at that time, just to set the stage for us.
Well, first, let me say that it was that program, but then we also worked together in what me and one of my colleagues called marriage counseling, because we had some difficulties and some tension as we worked together. And I remember you helping us try and work through that and try and find better ways to communicate with each other. So yeah, so I spent the first 2 decades plus of my professional career in the corporate world and, climbing the corporate ladder, as you will, looking for that next promotion, the next raise, the bigger team, building my kingdom. And ended up, after all of that, working at a startup, which I thought at the time was my dream job. So I had, the C-level title. I had equity. I had all of these different things that I had always wanted. And I said, I finally accomplished what I really wanted to do. And I was working, sometimes 16-hour days. It was a 7 days a week job, and it was really intense. And I remember we had just raised a Series B round of $115 million, which is no joke. And I had traveled with some of the founders to LA to buy some facilities because we were expanding really, really quickly. And when I got back to Toronto, I had COVID. And I was exhausted. I was kind of, running on coffee. Let's just put it that way. And I was on a technical call, as you will, and the call escalated. And at one point I said, I can't do this anymore. And I just shut off my laptop, turned off my phone, and walked out of my home office. And I heard my 2 kids, who at the time were maybe 9 and 6, playing in the basement. So I went downstairs and I saw them playing Legos, and I sat on the floor and started playing with them for about an hour. I was just like, and I found myself being present with them. And I said, oh my goodness, I have not been present for the past, it had almost been a year where I was like, kind of like this shell that walked around the house, and they would see me physically, but I wasn't actually there. So that night I was sitting in my favorite chair, and Adriana, my wife, walked in and she's like, Jon, are you okay? And I said, I think I'm done. And over the next 2 weeks, we decided to part ways amicably. We still work together with, I still, and they're a great company. And then, I started my consulting firm, went back to school and got my master's in psychology. And that's how I ended up writing the book and ended up here today.
That's an amazing journey. I'd love if you're listening to Jon's story, if it's relatable to you at all, put a thumbs up in the chat, or just let us know if you have that feeling of, like that, like as you're describing it. There's a phrase of a song that often when I'm spinning myself comes up in my head, and it's the Smashing Pumpkins. And the phrase is, despite all my rage, I am still just a rat in a cage.
I love that song.
And as you're talking that through, I'm like, that is often the feeling, right? That we're sitting with. What kept you there? Like when you look back now with the clarity of hindsight 2020, and looking back at that Jon, right, who was in that grind and going and 16-hour days and disconnected from your kids. What was driving all of that? Like, what was underneath that for you?
Yeah, Glenn. So the way I describe this feeling of, despite all my rage, I'm still just a rat in a cage. I call it survival mode in the book. And survival mode is the state of emergency, this 911, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where the world really, really narrows. And by the way, a lot of high performers operate in survival mode because it's
Yeah.
highly efficient, right?
Yeah.
If we decide I need to open a distribution center or I need to finish this huge project that costs millions of dollars, survival mode can be really helpful because it allows us to hyper focus and narrow our vision to accomplish whatever the goal is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's really costly though, right?
Mm-hmm.
So going through our life with this adrenaline and cortisol and just
Mm-hmm.
being in this constant state of where we feel our survival is actually at risk, it's incredibly costly to our system. And this is why people go into burnout,
Yeah.
because we are in this chronic state of survival mode that goes from being adaptive in a really small instance, right? So if you
Yeah.
were in the savannah and you hear a rustle in the bushes, you want to be in survival mode. That's really helpful. I grew up in Caracas, Venezuela, which is a very dangerous place. So being in
Mm-hmm.
survival mode was highly adaptive and it saved my
Mm-hmm.
life many times because I said, well, I'm not going to walk down this street. I'm going to walk down this other street, or I'm not going
Yeah.
to go out of my home after dark. And, but but when we get stuck in that state of survival mode and it becomes chronic and it becomes how we live our lives, it
Mm-hmm.
ends up taking a huge toll on our well-being.
Mm-hmm.
So the thesis of the book is that we can go from survival mode to thriving, and that we can do that by developing this skill called agency.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't talk a lot about agency. People, we hear it mentioned here and there, but we don't actually talk about what agency is. And I think, especially now with AI and as technology is getting more and more powerful, and
Mm-hmm.
being the smartest person in the room is no longer a competitive advantage, this idea of agency is going to have a tremendous amount of weight into how we navigate our careers and how we navigate our professional lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so much in there that I'm like my brain is going boom, boom, boom. I mean, one, I think to sort of reinforce the point, we just released our annual report on, the state of high potential leaders. 45% are citing firefighting as one of the biggest challenges that they're facing. It's crushing their career ambitions because they don't have time to think about development, which is what they're motivated by. We're kind of in a vicious circle around a lot of things. Organizations are unclear on the strategy, so they're moving the goalposts. And one of the things that talking about what you talked about in terms of this ability to kind of super hyper focus and zoom in. I've been working with hypos now for 35 years, and I always say I'm a recovering high potential. I think as you get older, your endurance kind of slows down, and you can look back on yourself and go, oh my god, I was insane when I was in that mode, right, when I was in that survival mode. But there's an innate motivational drive that a lot of people that are on this call listening have, to be successful, to achieve, to excel, to get, to make a contribution, like whatever is the drive, that driver underneath. And so I think we can look back on times like that in our lives. And when I coach younger leaders, who are in that mode, I see myself, I see the pressure people put on themselves, right? I often will say to my clients, I feel like you're like Atlas, like you're carrying everything, the weight of the world, and that hyper vigilance that you're talking about, right? Seeing, like looking to outmaneuver the situation and stay ahead of it. I think it's, I don't want to say it's, with age comes wisdom. We all sort of say that. But I'm curious, like if you were to be able to go back and talk to your 28-year-old self or 29-year-old self, what would you say to that person? Because I think there's
What do you
probably
mean?
people on the call.
I'm 28. What do you mean, Glenn? No. Um, I I think one of the reasons why we pursue success so relentlessly, it's because we want to feel safe.
Yeah,
If we look at it from a nervous system perspective, we're
yeah,
looking for safety.
yeah, yeah. So
And
it's almost
and
like
safe,
Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Like, what do I have to do to keep this job, to keep being successful, to keep that roof over my head at the very base level, right?
yeah. And for many years in my career, I went to bed went to sleep scared that I was going to get fired the next day. And if I
Yeah,
were
that's
to get
common. Yeah.
fired, I was going to be living under a bridge.
Mm-hmm.
That's where my mind took me. It immediately took me, I'm going to be fired and I'm not going to be able to care for my family and I'm going to end up under a bridge. And that whole train
Yeah.
of thought happened in fractions of a second.
Yeah.
When I started slowing down and analyzing it, well, even if I get fired, I could go get another job, or my wife works, I have a network of people who could support me. Doesn't mean that my house is going to get repossessed tomorrow. Like, it would take some time for that to happen. So when we slow down
Mm-hmm.
enough and when we are able to calm our nervous system down enough to engage with life intentionally, which is what agency is,
Mm-hmm.
then things start to change and we start to see options where we didn't see options before. And that takes some practice. It's a skill. So if I went back to and by the way, for a lot of us, that that pursuit of success is a pursuit of safety. And
Mm-hmm.
the interesting thing is that success, no matter how much we have, is not what helps us feel safe. It can,
Mm-hmm.
it, it can help, when you have a great salary, when you have a great title, when you have it can help, but it's not what's going to help you thrive. So, people often ask me, okay, so then what is thriving? So I say, let's talk about what thriving is not. Thriving
Mm-hmm.
is not success. So if we define success as power,
Mm-hmm.
status, and
Mm-hmm.
money,
Mm-hmm.
those are three incredibly powerful extrinsic motivators. And by the way, I want success just as much as the next person. There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with wanting success. Thriving, on the other hand, is about agency, meaning, and connection. And what I mean by connection is human connection, like what we're doing today in this community,
Mm-hmm.
or connection to nature, connection to animals, connection to the transcendental, to whatever you believe in. So success and thriving, if we can have kind of like a Venn diagram, then we get to choose. At some point, some of us may have to sacrifice or trade off some success for thriving, or trade off some thriving for success. And that's okay, as long as you're making that
Yeah.
choice.
Yeah.
When you are exclusively driven by those extrinsic measures of money, power, and status, which by the way are never ending, because there's always somebody next to you who has a higher rank. If you're the CEO, you have a board of directors. If you're a board of directors, you have shareholders. If you're a shareholder, like there's a cycle. There's always with success is a never-ending chase. You can always have more money, you can always have more status, and you can always have more power. And even the most powerful and wealthy people in the world are still looking for more. Elon just asked for a $1 trillion compensation package, right? Which gets you thinking, how unsafe must he feel to need anyway, I don't want to get into political commentary, but the point that I'm trying to make is that we've been sold this idea that if you're just successful enough, you'll be safe and you'll be
Yeah.
happy. And what the research is telling us, there's over 25 years of research in this field, research on well-being is telling us, is that the correlation there, it doesn't imply causation. Yes, having more money can help you have more well-being up to a certain degree, but at some point, it's diminishing returns. And what I'm advocating for in a guide to thriving is that we retake agency, we reclaim it, and we make it our own, and we start making intentional choices about how we want to engage with life.
Yeah, I think that is such a kicker for people, right? Recognizing that you actually do have a choice. The other thing I know, and I think what's interesting is like you had a very pivotal moment which pushed you into entrepreneurship. I had the same experience. I had come to believe that when I look back on my career up until that point, I always say the universe will hit you with a stick and it'll just keep hitting you with a bigger and bigger and bigger stick until finally you get the message on what you're supposed to do. But I can remember when I made that choice myself, I was the income earner. I was the only sole income earner. My daughter was 3 at the time. My husband was a stay-at-home father. And, quitting and was a frontline social worker. So it was very much when I made the choice to fully quit. I actually didn't feel like I actually had a choice. Like I was in a situation where
Mm,
I literally, all choices to stay had been removed from me because of who I was working for. And I can remember, though, being so bound by fear. And, oh my God. And my husband was walking around the house going, we're going to lose the house. We're going to lose the house. And I can remember saying to him at one point, I said, okay, but I'm trying to gain my life. Like I'm
yeah.
trying to gain my life. So what if we lose the house? Like if that's the worst thing that happens, like we have to sell the house and rent something, right? Sometimes you don't like the outcomes of the choices. That's not what happened to everybody. So don't worry about me. I didn't have to sell my house for, well, I did sell the house, but
But
for
Glenn,
a different
that's
reason.
a big deal what you're
Oh, it's
sharing, right?
huge.
And thank you for being so vulnerable and sharing that story, because a lot of us feel that so
Yeah.
often and we don't talk about it enough. We
Yeah.
don't talk about that fear that drives our decision making. Now, I would argue in your experience as you're sharing it right now, you were in a state of low agency, even though you decided to leave, right? You said, I don't have a choice. So if you look at agency on a spectrum from
Mm-hmm.
very low agency to very high agency,
Mm-hmm.
very low is when we say, I don't have a choice. And that's usually a clear sign of us being in a state of survival mode.
Mm-hmm.
When we say, I don't have a choice. And I remember saying this throughout my career. Quite often, I would say, I don't have a choice. I have to stay here. I don't have a
Mm-hmm.
choice. I
Oh,
got to
I
push
didn't
for
have a
another
choice
promotion.
but to leave, right? Like
Yeah.
I think that was the,
Yeah.
so in some ways the low agency maybe on that thing was actually the kick in the pants I needed to make the move that I hadn't been doing for many years. Like if you talk to my
Yeah.
husband, he would say to you, she'd been wanting to be an entrepreneur for 10 years. But the fear of I can't leave. We have a mortgage. I can't leave. We have a kid. I can't leave. People count on me. I can't leave. Like you make a ton of. And I think what I observe anyway, within myself going through that experience and with others watching them, is that you when you're stepping into something new, that expression leap and the net will appear. That's
Hmm.
very scary though, because what you're thinking about is what you're not going to have, right? You're thinking about all the things, like you can really fixate on what's gonna be removed from your life, right? And not, you don't know what's going to be on the other side of that. You don't know what's going to be on the other side. So I think we sold our house in a very desirable neighborhood to move to a quote unquote less desirable neighborhood, but out of a semi into a detached, into a community versus before we had neighbors. Now we have a community. So you don't know what you're going to gain through the change, but you can get stuck by fixating on what's going to be taken away, air quotes around that, right? And I think that's the piece that I feel like often gets a lot of us stuck. And then to your point, exactly, reducing agency, right?
Yeah.
Then you feel like you don't have that choice. And the other thing you said that I think is super important to just tap into is when we're in that fight, flight, freeze response mechanism in our amygdala, we're not thinking in our prefrontal cortex. So I love the thing that you said about like by slowing down, you actually can't think and see other choices because you're not in that fight or flight mode, right? You can actually get back into critical thinking and see what might be available to you.
Yeah. And the prefrontal cortex is a uniquely human thing,
Yeah.
right? There are not other species, as far as we know, that have that capacity to actually slow down and engage executive function and think through things in a systemic way. That's a really powerful and uniquely human capacity. Now,
Mm-hmm.
going back to the topic of agency,
Mm-hmm.
Glenn, so this idea, I don't have a choice, is like we said, very low agency.
Yeah.
If we
Yeah.
keep moving along the spectrum, we can go to what I would call it medium agency, which is when we see the world in black and white. So I can either do this, I can stay, or I quit. Right
Yeah.
now, I have two choices, but only two choices, and
Yeah.
that's still, it's higher agency because at least we're seeing a way out, and still we're not fully engaging that prefrontal cortex. When
Yeah.
we're in a state of high agency, a state of creativity, of calm, of connectedness, of community, all of these things, we start seeing, instead of black and white, a rainbow of options. We
Mm-hmm.
start saying, well, I can stay and I can change my job, I can apply to a different position, or I can move to a different division, or I can talk to my boss and figure out a different way to engage with my work. Or I can leave and I can be an entrepreneur, or I can go find another job, or I can rest for a few months. We start seeing all of these
Mm-hmm.
options in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think this idea of developing our agency is a really powerful way to take back our lives and to
Mm-hmm.
engage with life in an intentional way, as opposed to feeling like we're victims of our circumstances, which a lot of
So
us do.
yeah, and I think, I mean, so talk to me a bit about, it sounds like you had that moment where you're like, oh my gosh, something's got to change. You talked to your wife about it, that, which is absolutely right. I remember talking to my husband about, okay, I don't think I can do this anymore. You have that conversation. But who helped you sort of, how did you open up your mind to choices? Because I think the other thing about our brains is our brains are kind of lazy. We pattern things, and we have a tendency to go this or that, right? Or I don't have, and it can be hard to open yourself up to other choices. So what was the process you went through to start to create more agency for yourself and see more choices? Did you have people, supports, moments that helped that for you? Would love to hear that, because I bet you there's people on this call going, yeah, but I'm in the situation, I can do this or that. So how did you do it?
I would say all of the above. Whatever resources that you have that work for you, those are the
Yeah,
most important ones.
yeah.
Now, what I found as I started to research how do we develop more agency is that there were three things that kept coming up in the research. And I
Yeah.
summarized them in an acronym, AIR, AIR. And
Mm-hmm.
AIR stands for awareness,
Yeah.
inquiry, and reframing.
Yeah.
So the first thing is awareness, is to actually notice what's going on in the moment. And a lot of
Mm-hmm.
us often see the world from the neck up. We ignore our bodies. So awareness
That's
could
so
be,
true.
what is this tension? What is happening in my shoulders?
Yeah.
What is happening in my chest? Or awareness could be, what is the emotion that's coming up for me? Oh, I'm feeling fear, or I'm feeling grief, or I'm feeling sadness, or I'm feeling joy. And connecting with the emotions, connecting with the thoughts, starting to see the thoughts and let them pass by. This is what meditation, there's a lot of research on meditation of
Mm-hmm.
what it can do, or mindfulness. So awareness is the first step, just actually noticing what's going on in the moment and trying to create some distance from it, however small. Because when we're in a situation, it's like we are incited, we are subject to the situation. When we have awareness, we start to turn the situation into an object, something that we can actually hold and look at and explore. So that's step one, awareness. Step two is inquiry. Once we can turn it into a bit of an object, then we can start exploring it. We can start asking lots of non-judgmental, open-ended questions. And this is what the coaching process is so good at. And there are other ways to do it. People do it journaling, they do it talking to
Mm-hmm.
friends in groups. So we start getting really curious about the situation and asking questions. And once we do that, we get to see a lot of angles that maybe we didn't see before. We get to
Yeah.
learn a lot more about the situation or the experience or the emotion or the thought that we're dealing with. So that would be step two. Step three is reframing, and it's coming up with a different way to perceive whatever it is that we're experiencing, and and then using that as a way to propel ourselves to move forward. So let me give you an example. Um, so writing the book was a lot of fun. It was really challenging, and it took a lot of patience and care and dedication. But I was sitting in front of my laptop writing, you know, for months on end. And then I got into editing, and that was a little bit different. It was a little bit more uncomfortable because my circle, my sphere of for this project started to grow. I had other people looking at the work and offering their thoughts and their comments, so that was a little uncomfortable. But then I got to promoting the book, doing this type of stuff that you and I are doing right now, talking about it, talking about the ideas. And by the way, writing about something and talking about something, two very different things. They're
Yeah, for
very
sure.
different things. They
Yeah.
require different skill sets. So I went on this podcast, and this guy had done like 430 something podcasts. And this was like the third or fourth podcast that I had recorded. And as we finished the podcast, the guy, he presses pause on the recording and he says, "Hey, Jon, I've recorded 430 something of these. And I've never done this before, but I got to tell you, we got to re-record this. We got to do it again." And I was like, "What do you mean?" And he's like, "Well, it wasn't clear. The ideas didn't come through." My heart sank. And in
Mm-hmm.
that moment, I said, I do not want to do this.
Mhm.
I'm not going to record anymore. I'm going to cancel whatever I have. You know, in that moment, I
Yeah.
went deep into survival mode,
Yeah.
deep, deep, deep.
Yeah.
As I found myself getting some awareness of it and realizing, okay, so I recorded a bad podcast, right? So now I have awareness of the situation. And in the moment, I felt sad. I felt angry. I felt scared. You know, there were all of these feelings that came
Mhm.
up for me.
Yeah.
I started sweating. My palms, my hands got cold. All of these things happen in the moment. So I was the awareness. Then I started asking, well, what's really important for me about recording this podcast? It's a way to get the ideas out there. And I worked so hard on this project. I want to get the ideas out there.
Mhm.
And what are some other ways that I can do this? Well, you can write op-eds and write articles and do interviews. All of these things are going to require some degree of vulnerability. All of it is going to require some degree of discomfort. These are things that you've never done before. And eventually it was Adriana, my wife, who said, why don't you start looking at all of these podcasts that you're recording as practice? And the practice for what? And she said, just practice. And that reframe of saying, okay, no longer do I have to be my best self and I have to show up perfectly at every podcast, but these are just practices. The moment that reframe came up for me and I started believing it, I
Mhm.
started saying, okay, I can believe this. And I
Mhm.
started going into these podcasts. I started having more fun. I
Mhm.
still suck. I've been getting slowly, I've been getting better, but I still sucked. But at least I wasn't just being so hard on myself
Yeah.
and going into these things, sweating and being so nervous and so stressed. So awareness, inquiry, and reframe is what helped me take that really difficult situation and turn it into something that is meaningful to me. And
Mhm.
I have learned and grown a lot and met lots of great people. And some podcasts have been great and some have not been so great. And it's okay, right?
Yeah.
This is part of the journey that I'm on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, right? Because as I listen to you, I always listen to people's core values. What are their motivational drivers? What's hard about this situation for an individual versus what would be hard for somebody else about an individual? And I think one of the things I love the AIR model because it's nice and simple. When we kind of go back and unpack each one, I think this awareness piece, which, awareness is one of the foundational premises of the work that we do. I always think you can't lead other people if you don't know yourself. Like, forget it. And what I've also noticed is that there's a readiness journey around self-awareness because sometimes it can be very uncomfortable to look and see how your behavior impacts others, how your drive impacts others, and it's much easier to go, well, they just have to deal with me. I always love companies that have those colors. And, anytime I talk to a fiery red, it's like, I'm a fiery red. I get stuff done. I can break down doors. I push things through. And you go, yeah, and you're a jerk. You're a jerk. So what are you doing about that side of it? Like, that's the upside. What are you doing about the downside? Right. And the self-awareness without action is useless, in my opinion. You can be self-aware, but it doesn't mean you're going to take action. So for me, I think, as I listen to you, I think, yeah, like you need to know where, so that the inquiry can go, oh, I recognize right now for me, I like to achieve and I like to do a good job. I don't feel like I did a good job there. Ooh. And then we get
Yeah.
ego, right? Like the other, joke line I use all the time is your ego is not your amigo. And, you start to confront, which is uncomfortable, right? And how do you lean into that to understand yourself and why those things have triggered you in a way, right? That you can then move forward, right, to the next step. But I think a lot of it, and I look at my own journey. I think you can get stuck in that journey though, right? You can get stuck in aspects of that. It's like I'm feeling as I talk to you, it's like this is really an ongoing practice, right? So I'm
It
curious,
is.
like now that you've kind of landed on it, and like I mean, and I love that example that you shared of being in that moment with this experience you had about the podcast. Like, what have since you've kind of really done a deep dive into this whole area again, what have you found has come up for you in trying to live what you're now preaching. Like
Yeah.
what's the stuff you've learned is easy, hard, that you have to keep coming back to or reminding yourself of.
Yeah. So I was one of those red people, as you know, Klein,
I remember,
yeah,
Jon.
I could get stuff done like it
Mm,
was nobody's business. And once I had, a goal, it would be whatever it took to accomplish it, even if I
yeah,
left
yeah,
a trail of dead bodies behind me, which I
yeah,
often did.
yeah,
Um, what I learned, we grow up, we come up through the ranks in corporate settings,
yeah.
thinking the most productive person is the person who wins. The
Hmm.
person who is most productive is the person who wins.
Well,
And
let's
that
face it,
belief,
though, too. I just want to say, because that's what gets rewarded.
ah, yes. And because that's what the system has created, right?
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and and so we hold on to this belief for the dear life. My dad used to say, just make yourself indispensable. That's what
Yeah,
he used to say to me.
yeah,
so
yeah,
so that's a belief that was deeply
yeah,
deeply ingrained in me.
yeah.
What I realized, and this was later in my life, is that when we work in organizations, there's two types of there's many types of value, but there are two main big types of value that can be created. There's the productive value, which is I can complete this project, I can prepare the most beautiful, most strategic deck for the board of directors, or I can crunch numbers like it's nobody's business. Today I can use AI better than any of my peers, right? Like these are
Hmm.
all the productivity measures. So that's productive value.
Hmm.
And as you said, productive value often gets rewarded.
Yeah.
At a certain point in our careers, when we start leading people, it's not about productive value anymore. It's about relational value.
Hmm.
And it's about the capacity that we have to bring other people together to do things that one person alone can't do. And the moment I realized that relational value was just as important, if not more, as productive value in certain parts of my career, then I could start making those trade offs. So I think that the important piece here is realizing that I had this deeply ingrained belief. If you make yourself indispensable, make yourself indispensable and they'll always need you, which, by the way, as we all know, that's not the case.
No.
We all experienced this in COVID as people, were getting fired left, right, and center. We're
Yeah.
experiencing it right now. We're in the
Yeah.
middle of a recession in Canada, even
Yeah.
though nobody seems to be declaring it a recession and people are losing their jobs.
Yeah.
So, um, so, so the way to be safe, right? So we're looking for this safety, and we say, well, if I'm productive enough, I won't be fired,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Actually, I would argue if you're adding relational value, it's much harder to get fired because it's easy to find somebody else who can crunch numbers in the market. To find somebody else who can create relational value in a specific context, it's a very difficult thing to do. That requires a lot of skill set, and it requires a deeply ingrained relationships with people, deeply ingrained
Hmm.
connections. Um, so I think we've been mistaken about how we feel safer in our jobs.
Hmm.
And ultimately, line, what I realized is that safety often comes from within.
Yeah.
In a few thousand years ago, actually a few hundred years ago, it didn't. You needed to have all of this community if you wanted to be fed, if you wanted to be cured, if you wanted to all of. Today, this is the first time in human history that you can be 18 years old, get a job, start earning a salary, lock yourself in an apartment, and never come out again. You can get your
Hmm.
food delivered. You can get your medical appointments done online. You can get everything. So this self-sufficiency that we have created for ourselves is both a blessing and a curse, right? So,
Yeah.
so I think it's important to understand how do we define safety? What does safety mean for us? And what are the beliefs that we have underneath? The belief, a lot of times these are subconscious that are driving this constant search for safety. I think that's a really important idea. And I think we often overlook it.
Hmm. Hmm. Again, so many thoughts in my head. Folks, if you've got questions that you want to throw at Jonathan while we're here going through this, throw them in the chat. This is a great time to do that. I'm like, my boom, 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 because I've got like so many things. Yeah, but, and what about, and da da da. Um, I think what you make me think is this individualistic self-reliance, though, is a it's a falsehood. Like, I think whenever you read anything about when people are on their deathbed, what do they talk about? It's always relationships, right? Like, you read any of those stories, any of those books, it's always about the relationships that they built and they
Mhm.
had. I think the thing that is really tricky, and I can't get me on it, and I'd love people who are listening to this to throw their thoughts on this in the chat. I called out a very senior former CHRO on LinkedIn a few weeks ago because he was talking about how he spends a lot more time with his family now. When he was in his career, he didn't do that. Like, he didn't go to his kids' hockey games, and he didn't do that. And now, there he is now retired, and he's doing all the things that he would say to his younger self he should have been doing then. And I've done a lot of panels on work-life balance with very senior executives and fielded questions from groups on how do you do it and da 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 da. And all of them will say, oh, I wouldn't have worked as hard as I did then. I wouldn't have put as much pressure on myself as I did then. I wouldn't have done this. I wouldn't have done that. And I have to say, I kind of call BS on it, because what my question then, my follow-up question to them, as it was to the CHRO, was, okay, but if you hadn't done that, would you be where you are now? Because what gets rewarded in organizations is that, right? So
Mhm.
it depends on what you want out of your life. And I think what I find kind of interesting right now, and I think organizations are going to have to really wrestle with this with Gen Z. I've got a Gen Z daughter. So it's a very interesting mindset in this generation. I think it's going to look very different. People used to say millennials were very different. They're nothing compared to Gen Z. Gen Z is very different. And I will say they're not buying what companies are putting down around this: sacrifice yourself, give up your life, work 24/7. They're not buying it. And so I think, and I should say, a lot of them aren't buying it, but the ones that are, I would say, lean very heavily towards that result side. And so what I'm seeing a shift in a lot of organizations where we used to be pushing for people and results. Now it feels like we're pushing more for results and we're giving lip service to people. And I think a lot of that has to do with activist shareholders. I think it has to do with the capitalist system. And look, I'm not anti-capitalist, or capitalism, but there is a bit of a challenge in the system right now. And I think it's going to be really interesting the next 10 years. Everybody's talking about AI and the loss of the rung of the ladder for people entering the workforce. I think what's going to be more interesting is Gen Z coming in and what's it going to look like? Because I think that they, in a funny way, have a lot more grounding and what they're willing to put up with and what they're not. I don't know. What are you seeing? I'm curious, like, as I throw that out to you, what's your sort of
Yeah.
take on
Look,
generational pieces around agency and buying into what we all bought into, right? What we all bought into.
yeah. Listen, Klein, I grew up in a socialist country, so I'm also not advocating for socialism. I think capitalism, it has given us this Zoom call, it has given us this laptop, it has given us a lot of things. And I think, like any system, when it's unbridled, when it's
Yes.
unregulated, when there are no checks and balances to it, it can be harmful, which is what a lot of us are experiencing now. I want to go back for a second to the CHRO that you mentioned, and the
Yeah.
story about, yeah, but you wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that. And I think we often tend to look, yeah, first of all, hindsight's 2020. I was talking
Yeah.
to one of my friends at Indigo, and as you know, they sell books. So
Yeah.
she said, well, she sent me an interview of this author who sold 10 million books. And in
Mm.
the interview, he talks about this kid who was 16 years old who came to him at a book signing and said, "You saved my life." Because reading your book, I had suicidal ideation thoughts, and reading your book
Mm.
made me get help. And he said, that moment is what made it all worth it. And I said, yeah, that's easy to say after you've sold 10 million books. You know, you know what I'm saying? Like, there's this hindsight's 2020. Now, what I would say is that As much as I advocate for a lot of times exploring what got us to this point, in this case, it's better to say, hey, listen, all of these skill sets, like me being a red and me being,
Yeah.
you know, a chaser and a fixer and a
Yeah.
firefighter, all
Yeah.
of those things got me to where I am with you today, blind. But maybe, and there's just a 1% chance that the things that got me here, right, that has served me so well, may not serve me as well in the future.
Mm-hmm.
So can I take stock of those things and then decide what is it that I can do differently moving
Mm.
forward in order to find more agency, more meaning, and more connection in my life to thrive more? And by the way, on the point of capitalism, it wasn't built for thriving. Capitalism was built for success, and it's excellent at getting you success, at getting any of us success. But it is not built for thriving. It is not built considering
Yeah.
well-being in mind. And the research, is telling us this. There was a survey that just came out a few weeks ago that said 82% of workers in the US are saying that they are either experiencing or have experienced burnout in the past year. That's a big number. That's a
Massive.
big number.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to consider what are some of the systemic challenges that we're facing here.
Yeah. And I think, and thanks for the comment, Susan's comment about, you know, needing to really think about where your priorities are in your work life so that when you retire, you don't sort of get lost. There are a lot of people I see that when they retire, they don't know what to do with themselves. That's for sure, because they put their entire way of being into their job.
Their identity.
Exactly. Thank you. That's the word I was looking for. Their identity is their job. And I remember somebody said to me on one of our panels many years ago, hey, you're just renting your position. When you're in a position, you're just renting it. It is not who you are. And I think that's just such an important lesson, because there is a lot of status in our organization. My dad didn't retire till he was 76. And part of the reason he had a fear of loss of status. Because when you go anywhere, what's the first question people ask you? Oh, so what do you do?
Yeah.
Right.
So I started
And
saying I'm a dad.
yeah, I love that. Right. Like, I love that. Like, yes, who are you? Not this job, like associating ourselves with this work, right? Which is a transient experience
Yeah.
for most of us.
So
Um,
without getting to academic line,
mm,
there's a lot of research on self complexity, which is this idea of our identity. So what is an identity? An identity is a bunch of beliefs that are bundled together. These are
yeah,
all the beliefs that I have about myself. I remember being at a company that I was working at, and I was a VP, and I was very happy with being a VP.
yeah,
I loved it.
yeah,
And one day I was at a friend's office, a colleague's office that worked for me, and he said to me, "I got to get that S." I said, "That S? What do you mean by the S?" And he said, "The S." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "SVP." And from that day on, I said, I'm no longer happy with being a VP. Now I have to be an SVP. And I
right.
would not relent and it was one conversation. So, so there are all of these beliefs that we bundle together that make our identity. Now, research on self complexity, what it tells us is that when we don't attach ourselves to the SVP or to the VP identity or the director or manager or whatever that is, but we attach ourselves to multiple identities. I'm a dad and a walker because I walk every day, and I
Mm,
am I'm a friend, and I am, an author, which has been interesting to play around with that identity. When we actually see all of these identities and we're flexible about it, and we say,
mm.
well, maybe I'm an author today, but I may not be an author tomorrow. And how's that going to change? I have no idea. When we start letting go of those beliefs, we tend to be a lot more resilient. And our well-being suffers less when we experience setbacks. So it's a really powerful thing to put our identity in a place, look at it, deconstruct it, and then say, hey, I love it all, but I'm not going to get attached to it. I can let it go.
Yeah, and I think about that, like, we have one of our coaching clinic topics is on this concept of confidence, and it's like confidence isn't something that you have or don't have. It's and I picture it. We have this analogy and thing about a confidence lake, and your confidence is like a lake that is fed by a bunch of different tributaries. Work is just one, right? But what else feeds it, right? And so when you look at your life that way holistically, then if something does happen, if you have a misstep at work, if you have something not go well, if you have a lot of other things wrapped around you to protect you from going down on that one if that piece dries up for you. I can't believe the time. This has zoomed by. So we're coming towards the back part of the conversation. I'm curious on the note of we have a lot of people that are working in organizations right now that are under a lot of pressure, that are probably feeling like they are in survival mode, and maybe I always think financial considerations are a reality for a lot of people, and so some of the choices that we might that may be available may not be ones that we feel that we can do. So what advice would you have for people right now that are listening who may be feeling like they recognizing, okay, I can really see I'm in survival mode, but I'm not sure how to reframe that for myself? I know the AIR method, but like if we could drill into that a little bit more and say, what's one or two things that people could just do tomorrow or do right after this call to start to move forward in a direction? Because I think about this stuff, it's always a journey. It's not like, my husband's always, oh, I wish I'd like to do something with music. And I always say, okay, well, it's not going to just land in your lap one day that, there's going to be something with music. What do you need to do to create that momentum? So what would be a couple of things that people could do to get some momentum to move towards thriving? Of course, buy your book, but what else would you say?
So a caveat first. I had a really hard time finding a publisher for this book because
Mm,
the publishers kept telling me this is not prescriptive enough. We
yeah,
want you to be more prescriptive about what you need to
yeah,
do.
yeah.
And Wiley, who I'm really grateful for, finally said, "Okay, we're going to buy into this. Let's try it out." And they
Yeah.
allow me to do it. So setting that aside as a
Mm-hmm.
disclaimer, that part of the whole point of this book is for folks to develop agency. So if I was telling you what to do, that would be inflicting upon your agency,
So
right?
I won't leave
Infringing
it at steps that you're going to share, but maybe some ideas that you're going to
so,
share.
so, so here's an idea that I found
Yeah.
really powerful for me.
Mm,
Um, there's this equation: resources
mhm,
minus demands equals stress,
mm,
or equals burnout, or equals whatever you want. So I think it's really important for us to figure out what are the things that resource us and what are the demands that we have in front of us. The
mm,
resources, in my case, so I tried meditating for 2 years, Klein, and you knew me before this stage of my life, and it was really hard. And I bought one of those meditation cushions, and it was sitting in my office, and I would sit there and I would hate it. It would suck. And then one day, somebody said to me, "Why don't you try a walking meditation?" And it changed my life.
mm.
So now I go on walking meditations every day, almost every day. I go on walking meditations and I love it. And it's been life changing for me. So that was a resource for me. Another resource is I like to go floating in one of these
In the
tanks,
float
right?
tanks, in those dark
Yeah.
tanks? Oh
Yes,
my
I love
gosh.
it. Another resource for me is spending time with my kids. That's a big resource for me. It allows me,
Mm.
not all the time, sometimes when we're playing and having a good time, and playing with them is a resource. Demands are all of the things that we have to do at work, and that we have to engage with a boss who might be a micromanager, or this quarter the results were not what we were expected. So those are all the demands. So I think if we can have a list of all of the resources that work for us and all of the demands, so with the resources we can keep resourcing, we can keep adding resources to that list, and it's like a little toolkit of things that we can do. And on the demand side, this is where, this word has become really popular over the past 3 years. This is where we can set boundaries. What are the demands that we can set a boundary on? What are the demands that we no longer, because resources minus demands equals stress. If the demands are more than the resources, we're going to experience stress. And if the demands are more than the resources over a long period of time, we're going to experience chronic stress and eventually burnout. So I think for us to take stock what are my resources and what are my demands, and then do whatever we can to increase the number of resources and decrease the number of demands, then we can work with that equation to try and figure out a way to stay afloat as we learn how to hone in are intentional and meaningful.
Sorry, you went a little choppy there just at the end. I think the connection's been good up until this point, and it could be on my end, but anyway, hopefully people caught that last little bit there. Elena's got a question that she's just thrown in order to support leaders in becoming their authentic selves. What do workplaces do differently to support leaders in, being their authentic selves while driving results? Like if you're a leader of a team, what's something you can do? So shifting it, I think you just talked about putting your oxygen mask on first yourself, and can you do for yourself? But what can you do as a team leader to maybe create some of these conditions to help people thrive?
Yeah. So one of the things that I talk about in the book is this tension between authenticity and belonging. When we need to start sacrificing our authenticity in order to belong, there is often a problem.
Right.
So the question is, how can we create spaces where belonging is not conditional on you being 100%, oh, you're a great fit to this culture. It's okay if you're not 100% fit to this culture. So if we can treat this belonging as more of a spectrum and less of a binary, as leaders, if we can say, hey, listen, we'd like people to show up to the team meeting on a weekly basis. But maybe for somebody's really hard, I don't know. This is an example that's just coming off the top of my head. Maybe changing, shifting, accommodating what belonging looks like in the group to allow people to show up more authentically. Because when we ask people to both belong and be authentic, we're asking them for something impossible.
Yeah.
Because we're all different.
Yeah.
We're all different. So I think it's important to just bringing up that tension and having a conversation about it can be a really, really powerful way to shift the dynamic of the conversation and to create a sense of psychological safety in the group.
Yeah, I love that. It makes me think of team norms and collectively creating those together so that we can all, because I also know people interpret things differently, right? What I think is being collaborative, you might think is being not at all, right? And so I think the way that a team leader can kind of create that space for people to have their say, put in their thoughts, but also, create a shared sense of belonging as opposed to binary. Well, Jon, thank you so much for being here. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. It has been just an absolute delight. I love, yes, you were a very strong red driver when I knew you in the program, and it's been amazing to watch the transformation and the journey. And I think that's what it's all about. So check out Jon's website, A Guide to Thriving. He's got a great book and also a great workbook that goes along with it that has those of you who like self-reflection, some great stuff in there. From our side over here at the Roundtable, what's coming up now, if you are interested in kind of your own deep dive into who you are, we are enrolling for that program that I met Jon through, the Roundtable for Leaders. This is our open enrollment program. If you sign up before the end of the year, we're going to give 10% off. It's a director VP level program that's enrolling now. So contact Colleen if you want more details on that one. And then we've got our report on high potentials out. You can grab that from our website. Maybe Claudia, you can put the link in the chat for everybody. There's a QR code there. I never get that to work on my phone, but anyway, we'll send out the link to in our follow-up. And then coming up in January, I'm going to be joined by my good friend and content partner, Leanne Davey. We're going to talk about moving beyond firefighting and how can you lead when the pressure is on your team. So almost like a good, I think, follow-up from this conversation, actually. And then after that, I've got Maria Brown, who's our partner on the Roundtable report. And we're going to do a deeper dive into high potentials, talk about what Gen Z is going to look like when they come in, and just, some of the things that are coming up around this particular talent group. So hope you join us there. And as always, stay in touch. You can find us on LinkedIn and website and all of those kinds of good things. But happy holidays, everybody. I am wearing my Joy sweater today. Got a Christmas lunch, but it's also seemed very fitting for today. Great to have you all here. Thank you so much for being here. And I hope 2026 is a thriving year for all of you. And thanks again, Jon, for being here.